Welcome to SIIMCast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics in Medicine.
Welcome to this episode of SIIMCast. Today we're going to be speaking with the three co-founders of the group Radiologists for a Sustainable Future. First, we have Julia Schoen, who is a musculoskeletal radiology fellow at Wake Forest University School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She has undergraduate and graduate degrees in environmental engineering and co-chairs the American College of Radiology Task Force on Environmental Sustainability and Climate Change. She's also part of the radiologist subgroup for Healthcare Without Harm Physician Network, dedicated to advancing sustainability in the radiology department. Next, we have Beth Zygmunt. Beth is a cardiothoracic radiologist and associate professor of radiology at University of Vermont Medical Center. She's passionate about communication, advocacy, and policy as tools for addressing climate change, and serves on the American College of Radiology Task Force on Climate Change and Sustainability, as well as the Association of University Radiologists Committee on Climate Change and Sustainability. Finally, we have with us Kate Frederick Dyer, who is an assistant professor of abdominal imaging in the Department of Radiology and Radiological Sciences at Vanderbilt University, where she serves as medical director of CT and MRI for the body imaging section. She participates in radiology quality improvement and MRI safety committees and is one of the founding members of the Environmental Sustainability Working Group at Vanderbilt and the Radiology Climate Action Work Group there. And as a special treat, our very own Arjun Sharma came out of retirement because this topic is near and dear to his heart. Hope you enjoy the episode. All right, well, welcome to this episode of SIIMCast. So I want to kind of start out and find out kind of the origins of this Radiologists for a Sustainable Future. Julia, do you think you could enlighten us to a little bit about the origins of the group and how it all got started?
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of funny story. Geraldine McGinty sent out a tweet saying that she was looking for co-authors on an article on climate change and radiology. She was then, I think, president of the ACR. And she got together the group of people who responded to that tweet. Arjun, I think you may have been one of them too, and had us sort of answer a few questions. And then sort of emailed us all and said, you know, this is great. We'll work on this paper. Maybe we'll do something later. And I remember at the time thinking, wait, we've got all these people who are really motivated together. Like, we can do more than just write a paper. And I sort of emailed her and said that. And she was like, that's great. That's what I was planning. You want to organize the first meeting? And so that's sort of how our very first meeting happened. And then, you know, we sort of gathered together some other folks from Healthcare Without Harm who were part of their physician network. And we've just continued to grow from there.
At the time, were there other organizations within radiology or medicine? Obviously, you mentioned Healthcare Without Harm, but to your knowledge at the time, what kind of sustainability in radiology, what groups were out there?
To my knowledge, there were not many groups. You know, it's something I'd had a strong interest in medical school. I'd looked around I'd found actually an earlier podcast that you guys had done interviewing Kate Maturin. I think that was one of the few there were a scattering of papers out there, and that was one of the few sort of media presentations addressing sustainability in radiology. Healthcare Without Harm's physician network, you know, it was a broad network that incorporates all specialties, but, you know, at that point we didn't have a group of radiologists together, to my knowledge, who were focused on addressing this.
Why do you think that was, that it took a little bit longer for radiology to get into it? And do you think radiology is one of the fields that is more or less involved in kind of medical waste in general?
Yeah, so I think it's a topic that is immediately obvious if you're sort of in infectious disease or primary care and feels further removed from our day-to-day work in the reading room. But in terms of why it took so long, I don't think radiology is actually that much slower than most specialties. I think, again, there are a few specialties that maybe were ahead of the curve, but I think that it just healthcare and medical professionals in general, I feel like, have been slow to get into sustainability. And there's probably a whole multitude of reasons for that. And, a lot is just how much we have on our plates and the complexity of healthcare these days.
Okay. And just kind of finishing that discussion line of questioning, has the landscape changed, I think, in the, 4 or 5 years now since the group was formed? Have you seen additional groups inside or outside of radiology?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I think that, the landscape has dramatically changed. So there are multiple groups in radiology. AUR, ACR now have sustainability committees. I know RSNA is working on efforts. I'm not sure if they have a formal committee or not. CAR, the Canadian Radiology Association, also has their own sustainability task force. So a lot of organized momentum in radiology. And then, in the broader sustainability community, again, talking about the Healthcare Without Harm Physician Network. In 2018, I went to their conference and they had sort of a tiny dinner for physicians and trainees interested who were participating in that conference. Maybe there were sort of 20 people there, and I can name all the other medical students who were there. We've kept in touch. But I went this past year again, and, there were hundreds of people there. They couldn't even host a dinner big enough for all the physicians who were attending. So I think there's just been a huge momentum for this topic across specialties.
Beth and Kate, have you guys noticed momentum at any of the other conferences you've gone to?
Well, as far as conferences, we had a whole theme of climate change and sustainability at AUR a couple of years ago, where we had a lot of speakers and a lot of presentations. I'm just thinking locally, really, I started reaching out to Healthcare Without Harm, I guess around 2020, 2019. I'm sort of a latecomer to this, but they got me in touch with, some folks at my own institution. Amy Collins, who runs Healthcare Without Harm, reached out to me personally and put me in touch with a couple of other folks. And, the sense that I got from them, having been fighting this fight for a while, was that, they were frustrated and weren't getting anywhere. But that's really started to change over the past couple of years. The institutions become more interested. There are a lot more physicians that are interested in sustainability and its effects on human health and how to keep humans healthy through this and increase resilience. And so, both at conferences and also, in my own institution, I've seen a change just in the past few years.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think this movement has a lot of momentum now, not just in radiology, but across the board. Even this morning, my own organization, the Family Medicine Department, hosted a panel about climate change and human health. I gave a grand rounds a couple weeks ago. There's another panel coming up in about, I think in another week, actually, next roughly 10 days. So I think there's a lot of momentum in individual organizations. And also, I don't have much to add to what Julie and Kate have said, except that I agree with the fact that, there's just a broad interest in this topic. Now that we're starting to see the impacts of climate change very clearly, I think, physicians are becoming more concerned. Another thing that I want to mention about radiology specifically is that, compared to other specialties, I think the momentum in radiology has been especially fast, especially strong. I think with the organization of RADs for a Sustainable Future, and then we haven't talked about this yet, but passage of the ACR resolution and the formation of the committees through the ACR and the Association of University Radiologists, just the number of people who are willing to jump in and get involved, I think has grown pretty rapidly. I made an effort to get some people to sign on to an advocacy letter over the summer, and I think radiologists had the most sign-ons than any other specialty that was engaged in that advocacy work across the country. So we had like 61 people sign on to this letter to the Environmental Protection Agency, and that was more than any other specialty that was involved in the effort. So I think we have a lot to be proud of, and there's certainly a lot of interest, and we need to keep letting that, snowball. So just a big shout out for radiology, because I think we are really strongly in the mix now.
Can I ask, and this might be Bit of a tricky question. It's great that, of course, we're getting more attention and more involvement in radiology and beyond in medicine. Has that been tied to any wins, either politically or, with pressure against the industry that we can point to yet? Or are we still kind of in the contemplation stage where we're just starting to apply pressure, but we haven't quite gotten to the point where we can point to things that have been, tangible wins?
I think that's a great question. And I think that's probably one of the more frustrating aspects of sort of trying to engage in this work. Yes, I think that we've had big wins in terms of engagement and attention to this topic, and slowly we're starting to get resources dedicated to it. But in terms of tangible wins on a large scale, it's hard to point to one specific thing. I do think industry is engaged. And I think that is, in the long term, going to be a great partnership for sort of making wins and gains in energy efficiency in radiology. I think there's a lot of sort of pledges and attention from healthcare administration towards this topic, which is extremely important, in the long term to being able to make changes in our departments. But I think it will take time to kind of see that really become a tangible, meaningful gain in terms of environmental impact. Beth and Kate, I don't know if you have a different perspective on that.
I thought a lot about this before the podcast, actually, because I think this is a really important question. Are we actually having an impact? And there's actually a fair amount of literature on this. I don't know if I would say a lot, but there's a fair amount of literature talking about the importance of just communicating on climate change and sustainability and the impact that that has in and of itself. And that actually is one of the strongest motivators for other people to get involved and start talking about it and doing things in their own personal lives and trying to do things in their work, in their organization. So I think just by spreading the word and being an organization that people can connect with and feel like there's a place for this energy that they have around the subject, I think that's a huge win in and of itself. It's harder to say, oh, we're actually cutting greenhouse gases by doing this work. But I think that every little thing we do to get the word out is critically important. And there's this other phenomenon called behavioral tipping, where, it's basically a fancy word for peer pressure. And there's been quite a bit of research showing that if you can get a critical mass of people to do something or become interested in doing something, then other people start doing it. I totally agree with what Julia said. And I think we're having an impact that's difficult to measure, but is certainly real.
Yeah, and I think I want to add to what I said before, just because I don't want to be so pessimistic. Like, the healthcare system, right, is anachronistic to change. When I started doing this, when we formed Radiologists for a Sustainable Future, it was like, oh my God, we have this group of 10 radiologists. We're really motivated to do this. We're going to measure radiology's carbon footprint. And, by the end of the year, we'll have gotten something, we'll be net zero as a special, just like completely ambitious and unrealistic goals. But like, the truth is, that's not how things happen in healthcare. And I've definitely come to see that, like, you have to play the long game. And so, for example, the Joint Commission proposed regulation around carbon emissions, which did have a lot of pushback, ultimately became sort of an elective metric and initiative for hospitals to participate in. But right, that's the first step. First, you have the elective one, and then there's the next round of going through the Joint Commission and trying to get them to pass that kind of regulation, and more people getting on board in anticipation of regulation. And like, yes, it's a long process, but I think that, just sticking with it, you start to see that these different pressures will eventually move the lever and sort of change things.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, my question was an unfair one, and I knew I was posing a sort of devil's advocate. In this country, our political system is almost designed right now to be immobile on a lot of things, and you can have enormous popularity for things like background checks on guns, for example, and still have no movement through Congress in its current state. And then the other thing is, I mean, even just a few years ago, we didn't have any data. Like, before you try to implement change, you need to have some data about where you are, right? So it was only a few years ago that, like, Kate had that paper about the impact of MRI machines and CT scanners, or I think you did maybe 2 papers on that, whatever it was, just to assess what the energy use even was in the first place. So before you can do any of these other efforts, and it takes time, like I'm saying, you need to assess where you are and build up a groundswell of attention.
And I don't think we should minimize how big of a deal it was, for example, that we just got this ACR resolution together. That was a huge thing for our organization. That was a big change for us to kind of get together as a group and, declare that we wanted to join the Medical Society on Consortium on Climate and Health and make this declaration that climate change is hurting Americans and humans now, and we need to decrease fossil fuel use. I live in a red state, so any momentum feels like a lot. And I went in front of my local state chapter for the ACR and talked about it and got positive and negative feedback, but it eventually went through at the national level. So that was a big deal. All of the educational initiatives, the poster writing, the various speaking engagements, the papers, all of that is planting seeds. It's a snowball effect. And, we have a network now that goes across the country. We've had industry reach out to us and want to partner and talk about how they can promote their sustainability initiatives, as well as, we had a talk about Energy Star ratings with Rads for Sustainable Future recently. And, there's a lot of education that's got to be done first, a lot of groundwork before we can really make change. And I think it's happening. So
I'd like to say about the group in general is that we each have, at least this is what I've realized about our group, we each have our own specific interests, strong interests. For example, my own interest is largely in policy and communication and advocacy rather than research. Other people in the group are more interested in research, but it's just a really, really fertile ground for getting educated. If you join a group like this where you have different people, really smart people with all these different interests, and they bring things to the table that you may not bring, just being in the room together is a really fantastic educational experience. So, it's kind of a plug for people to join us if they're if they're listening at all, because, the more talent we have in the group, the more impact we can have.
So is it just education and policy that are the current challenges that you guys feel like you're facing, or are there other things out there other than the anachronistic way that we do medicine in this country?
Time and money.
Yeah. Fair.
We're all busy physicians, and this is all volunteer, and we got to make time for it, but it's important. So we do our best.
I was just going to say, in terms of, I think, and this sort of echoes off of what Beth was saying, I think one of the greatest strengths of the group is just being a platform for knowledge transfer, and sort of, unlike some of the other groups we mentioned previously, it's open to anyone. And, we don't necessarily have as many resources, but we also have zero restrictions. And that means that, you can openly talk about barriers you've kind of faced in your own sustainability efforts, and kind of work on troubleshooting together, and we can sort of go in whatever direction group members need in terms of supporting their own efforts. And so I think that's a really powerful thing, to kind of be able to crowdsource our efforts and learn from each other.
So kind of reframing Prasant's question, I was wondering, because I had to miss the most recent call, somebody got sick and I had to cover them on the evening shift. Has the group's focus changed over time? I know, initially we were dealing with the growth in the group and just kind of governance and trying to figure out what we were going to be and what the areas of interest would be, the leadership, all that sort of thing. What kinds of directions has the group taken on, and where are the more recent areas of focus?
After we set up the leadership structure and who was kind of going to do what, we split it into these different categories, different teams, policy team, education team. We have a social media team. We have someone who just drafted sort of a preliminary website for us, which is a huge endeavor. Communications. So we have all these different teams now that are trying to make headway. So I just wanted to throw that out there that, it has sort of morphed into more of an organized structure rather than, just meeting and talking about whatever topic happened to be on someone's mind during a particular period. So
think one of the issues we're trying to navigate now is how best for this group to engage with industry in a non-biased, well, kind of way,
Yeah, I think that that's something that my thoughts have evolved on over time as we've kind of been, forming this group and figuring out what our strengths and weaknesses are. I think, our strengths are certainly education and advocacy efforts, right? We have a great platform where if you have a member who's interested in some kind of advocacy effort that they're willing to take on, they can kind of do the bulk of that, and then they can share that with members, and you can have sort of a variable level of engagement in that effort that works very well. Similarly, with educational efforts, we can get together, we can have sort of either efforts to present at conferences or write papers together, that kind of things, or have internal meetings where we just focus on a topic group members are interested in. We, have dabbled in different ideas for research or quality improvement, and I think there's a lot of potential there. I think especially, again, it's a little bit harder because we are geographically diverse, right? Nobody's at the same institution. We don't really have sort of financial or logistic resources, which does make some of that sometimes more challenging. But for example, one thing we've discussed that I think would be a really great idea, and actually I've discussed with quite a few of the MSK radiologists in the group, is just, coming up with a standardized checklist of materials for procedures that group members could kind of share and then use at their own institutions to reduce waste. So I think there's a lot of potential for different research and QI efforts, but it's not as easy to execute those as it is for us to do kind of different education and advocacy things.
I think the funding and sponsorship question is a really interesting one. And SIIM, this podcast is for SIIMCast. SIIM is an organization that has embraced industry influence in the past. I mean, it doesn't try to be necessarily influenced by industry, but hold the hands with the industry and work together on topics. But that also has created conflicts in the past. There's been topics that I've wanted to talk about that we haven't really been able to go into because one of the major sponsors represents a segment of the industry that would be negatively impacted if we were to go and say we should change the way that we make recommendations around this one topic, because maybe that industry shouldn't really exist. That segment of industry just kind of cornered its market, but there's no real reason why it needs to exist. And so you do end up getting a major conflict, whether or not you're having everyone declare their conflicts of interest, you still end up with both direct and indirect entanglements that limit your ability to do things. And for, climate change, especially, that's going to create a real problem. I know we talked a long time ago about potentially having some industry sponsorship for the sustainability radiologist group. And I'm wondering if that continues to be a topic, and if you guys have come up with a strategy for how you would even agree as a group to take on the right fit, anything like that. Recognizing that funds do allow the group to grow in ways that you otherwise might not be able to.
Yeah, so I think we are a little further than, I know we had those discussions early on, Arjun, a little further on that, just in our sort of discussions with Healthcare Without Harm on how that would meet and how that would work. And, because we are, after we started our group, we, linked up with them to sort of become their radiologist specific network. And they have sort of different rubrics for evaluating industry partnerships. We recently met with them about a potential partnership that sort of fizzled, which, may be for better or for worse. But I think that as these things sort of pop up, we'll continue to sort of meet with their leadership, have a little bit more guidance, which is nice, because certainly I'm not as familiar with kind of developing these relationships and avoiding conflicts of interest, and they kind of have a whole team for that. And then, my hope is if we do end up, having any kind of partnership that involves financial resources, that they would also have the logistic support to host that, because we don't really have any administrative capacity. So I think that, that is how at this point we're planning to handle it moving forward. But it just, it's sort of a conversation that continues to evolve.
What I would add to this is that, we have so many challenges to meet as a group that these industry partnerships have kind of just not been a high priority because they're so complicated, right? Don't you think? I agree with everything that's been said. It's sort of fraught territory to wander into. And when you have so many other high priority things to think about, kind of goes on the back burner a little bit. The other thing that I think is really interesting about the industry piece, and I know Julie and Kate are aware of this, but there's some interesting regulatory developments coming down the pike in Europe, for example, and hopefully also in the United States via the Security and Exchange Commission and some regulations that they may be releasing, hopefully in early 2024, that may actually just force the hand of industry to start being more sustainable and reporting their greenhouse gas emissions and, their roadmap for decreasing those emissions. So it would be really interesting to see what happens with that and how we can, I guess, help our industry partners, meaning all of them, to work towards those goals. And I could go into more detail, but I don't want to waste anyone's time with details. So.
No, that's interesting because, we talk on this podcast, a lot of it is obviously America-centric because we're all here. A couple of our co-hosts are Canadian, so we get some of the input from what's going on in their country too. So it's always interesting to hear about what's going on in other countries like EU or whatever is, potentially affecting what happens here. So please, if there's more information about that, that's actually really interesting about how you're saying through Security and Exchange Commissions of all places.
Well, in Europe, there's something called the European Corporate Sustainability Standards, and they've got very strict rules coming into effect about reporting by large companies of greenhouse gas emissions, the various scopes of emissions, scopes 1 through 3, and they're going to have to report. And also my understanding, and I may be a little off on this, but also, what's their roadmap for cutting their emissions over time. So, there's going to be a heavier regulatory hand in this, I believe, based on what Europe is doing. There's a lot going on. There are new carbon pricing schemes that ultimately I think will trickle down to the United States. We're sort of slow, as you pointed out. Congress moves at a glacial pace. The United States may lag a little bit in some ways, but California just passed a law, right, about ESG reporting. So, when California does something like that, admittedly, there are going to be some snags there in terms of implementation, but things start to trend in that direction. And I believe that industry is going to have to start doing these things. I don't know what the timeline for that will be in the United States, but.
The other thing that I would say is that actually at this point, I would say industry is on a certain level ahead of us. And this may be because of the regulatory environment in Europe, but there's actually technical documents by industry. COSIR is the European Medical Imaging Trade Association, and they, have for years sort of published these reports on their sustainability and efforts to decrease the impact and energy use of scanners. And more recently, it sounds like that group has sort of, and again, all this stuff is sort of a moving target, but they've formed a larger international group that they're calling MIPA that, again, is all sort of looking at how we can make imaging equipment more sustainable. And, they're sort of publishing documents out there on our environmental impact. So actually, when I've spoken with industry, they've sort of said, we just haven't seen interest from our market on this. So, why, one, we need a market that's interested in sustainability to want to make these changes in our product. But two, why would we tell radiologists we're doing these things if they don't care about it? So I think there is more going on than we might know.
When I heard a couple of weeks ago that the EU was going to force USB-C chargers on all devices, essentially, like all Apple products too, like that's a huge thing, right? So I think you're right that the EU is driving a fair amount of these things.
You think about it like Siemens, Philips, many of our sort of big companies are based in Europe. So they're going to be, certainly.
Yeah, Agfa there too. A bunch of them, they are. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So what brought each of you into this group? Beth had mentioned a little bit about her areas of interest, but Kate, Julia, what are some of your areas of interest specifically in this?
Sure, I can go next. So I guess I came to the group a little bit later than Julia and Beth, but Twitter, I think, has been a great connector. So, I think around 2019, 2020, when I, got eager to start trying to do something about climate in my own life. I started reaching out to organizations. I believe I saw a Twitter post about Rads for a Sustainable Future, either something that Dr. McGinty had shared or maybe from Julie or something. So I, reached out and started showing up at Zoom meetings. And I had also reached out to Healthcare Without Harm, and they were great about getting me in touch with other folks at my institution in different disciplines, dermatology, anesthesiology, and collaborating in a multidisciplinary approach that way. So, I'm interested in, getting a lot of people together with a lot of good ideas and learning a lot. Showing up at the Zoom meetings, I started taking notes for the group, and I learned a ton that way. Just listening to Beth talk about policy, and Mara Brown, who's the BC Planetary Health co-founder, talk about some of the projects she's been doing. I mean, we have some great people that come to the meetings and talk about what they're up to, and I learn a lot from all of them. So that's kept me engaged.
Yeah, I think for me, almost more of a question is how did I end up in radiology? I had a background in environmental engineering before medical school and was doing some work in sort of global health and water resources before I even decided to go to medical school. And when I did, I thought I would do infectious disease or something that really sort of naturally married my past and future as a physician. But I did just, I've always liked physics. I liked radiology a lot when I was in medical school and realized that that's kind of what I wanted to do, and got connected with Kate Maturin and knew that some way I would fit, environmental action into my career. It's just been a matter of figuring out where, and this group has obviously been a key piece in that for me.
If I could add something, I think, all of us, I just want to put this out there because I think all of us come to this movement because we realize that everything we care about is threatened right now by this crisis. So, anyone who's listening, I think, has a sense of that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening. I think you guys are here maybe because that's the way you feel. I know that we all share this sense that we have a responsibility to protect everything we love, which is now at risk. So I think if there's a reason to be here, that would be it. I just want to put that out there. I shouldn't speak for other people, but I kind of get that sense about the ladies in the room.
Well said.
All right. So kind of closing up, I agree with you, Beth, that I think we're all here primarily because we care about, the environment, sustainability, and for how long we can continue to do this first. But when I was more active with the group, tried to, as I was bringing a lot of the younger medical students and so forth into the group and trying to get people interested. And one way of doing that was I always told them, like, this is a wide open space right now. It's not very difficult to get published. It's not hard to get presentations. So if you want to get your name on some stuff, this is a really good thing to get involved in. Are there any low-hanging fruit projects that the group is working on right now, or are there people that they can get hooked up with in the group if they do want to start to get active in conferences or get their names on some papers?
I would encourage people to just start looking around because I think that there are opportunities. For example, it's the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, for example. Just an example, there's a call for topics out right now, I believe. I think it's still current. And, I think there's another journal called the Journal of Climate Change and Health. There are lots and lots of types of papers that go into these journals related to climate and sustainability. And radiology seems to have maybe not an edge, but I think maybe it's not the specialty that people would think of when they think of this sort of thing. So if you're a radiologist and you're interested in these topics and you want to publish something, I don't know. I think there are lots of ideas, and our group would be happy to connect with people who are interested in, for example, like Julia said, for SUSQI, sustainability QI, lots and lots of ideas for collaboration across organizations. There's just no shortage of ideas, and there's no shortage of organizations that are looking to publish this type of thing right now, I think. So I would say go for it. And if you need tips, contact some of us and we can sort of try and help and point you in the right direction.
The other thing I would say in terms of low-hanging fruit is that there are things that seem like low-hanging fruit. Like everyone, I think, I'd say 90% of the people I've talked to in radiology have come to this and be like, I want to pick an easy project to start with in my department and, just have a little win at the start. Tries to get their department to turn off computers at night when they're not in use. And I have yet to meet someone who is successful at that. Yet it seems like that should be low-hanging fruit. And so I think my advice to anyone looking for something like that is, unless you have a really great idea, in which case you should just go for it and see, where it goes. But if you're just, you don't know where to start, take something you're already working on, or, a project you can easily get integrated into, and then look at the environmental impact of that. Whether it's looking at, changes in some kind of QI process in your department, or if you're, interested in intervention and looking at, and, just adding in a piece where you're looking at, the procedural waste from that kind of intervention. I think that can make it easier to start. And, any activity that we have in our departments is going to have some kind of environmental impact, and you may find new ways to decrease that.
Yeah, I would just add on to Julie and Beth and just say that there's so much work to be done in this space. It really is, like you said, Arjun, it's really very wide open. And there's, a lot of QI type projects that very much have some sort of environmental act and can kind of fit in with what you're already working on. We did some measuring around implementing and installing multi-dose contrast injectors, for example, before and after. We did, some work with trying to educate folks to use appropriate waste streams like red bags, putting infectious waste in the red bag only, and then, putting non-infectious waste in the correct receptacle otherwise. It's easy things like this that just studying them and trying to implement and change behaviors that, can make a big impact. Since you guys are an informatics organization, the workstation energy use, something that we've all sort of in our heads against as far as, why can we not solve this problem? But perhaps, one of your listeners will have a great idea for how we can balance the needs of trying to decrease workstation usage and also, keep hospital security, technological informatics security optimized as well, and push updates appropriately. The more brains we have working on this and working off each other's ideas, the further we'll get and the faster we'll go. There's a lot of things like better ordering tools that use the ACR guidelines that, avoid repeated exams. And there's so much work to be done in, wasted imaging that could really have has a big environmental impact. So, these are getting to be bigger and bigger projects, but, anything you can do to chip away at any of these larger projects is going to be helpful for sure.
I'm going to add one thing that Kate made me think of while she was talking in terms of advice that I think I've learned in this process for low-hanging fruit projects. And this is cliche, but take advantage of a crisis, right? Because I think one of the efforts that most of our group members have had success in is either getting contrast recycling or multi-dose contrast injectors into their, or just, general ways of reducing contrast waste. And all of that sort of came out of, having contrast shortages. So that's something that, as you're looking for ways you can implement change in your department, that's going to be an opening where you can, really start to make a difference.
And I think a lot of these things have this, perceived upfront cost. And there truly is some upfront cost to a lot of these efforts. But, once you start gathering data and showing, that things are more efficient and we're not wasting supplies and can show a monetary advantage to leadership, the more engagement you'll get after doing these sort of low-hanging fruit projects.
I'd also encourage people to, go talk to techs in ultrasound or MRI or around the department, talk to the film room, because a lot of those people will just ask them, like, are there areas of waste that you see every day? They see stuff that you have no idea about, when you're just cornered in the radiology workstation. So it's good to get ideas from others, and then obviously talking to people in different departments as well, but that can become a little bit more difficult as well.
Yeah, just before closing out, when I was putting away my sharps the other day into the bin, I looked down and I saw barium containers from the swallow study that I'd done earlier that day. I'm like, this is not infectious. This should not be in the red bin. And now you can't go and get it out of there.
It's so expensive.
It's so expensive to get rid of hazardous waste.
Expensive.
It is super expensive. And a lot of the time it's weight-based too. And barium isn't light. I'm just, oh my God, like, why is this in here? Like, yeah. So we're going to be going through a lot of that. And then like the vials of contrast that are in there, those vials have never seen patient. They've never been exposed. So they're not hazardous, right? We should be able to recycle it, even if they've dumped the contrast down the sink. Obviously, we have to check on that, blah, blah, blah. But nonetheless, like the glass can be recycled. Why is this in hazardous waste? It's so expensive. So yeah, there are a lot of different things that people can work on. So thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate it. It was great chatting and getting to learn a little bit more about the group and how people can kind of get going on their own journey.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
SIIMCast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at SIIM_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.